Hello and welcome to the latest edition of Inside the Fightback, and this week it's my pleasure to introduce a man who is at the heart of it all, Dennis Galimberti. Thanks for joining us, Dennis.
It's a pleasure, Rob. Good to be back.
I can't wait to take a trip down memory lane and get some of the detail and some of your recollections of what was a pretty wild time in the club's history. But can we start? Let's start in the present day. And what's your relationship to footy these days, and more specifically to the Dogs?
Oh, pretty close. Peter Gordon's probably one of my best friends, and I see Peter often, and we talk about the fortunes of the club. And I made a lot of lifelong friends, particularly out of the Fightback, and people like Irene Chatfield and Les Twentyman have become lifelong friends of mine, and we love to catch up together and watch a game and reminisce over the old days. But it's a totally different club now to what it was back in the late 80s.
I can imagine. So, are you going to games? Are you a regular?
I get to as many games as I can. Billy and Eliza, my children, are mad Bulldogs supporters, and they love to go. Billy plays for East Malvern, so he's got commitments there. And when I left the Bulldogs, I went back to Sandringham. Sandringham Footy Club was my original club. And when I left the Bulldogs in 96, I went back to Sandringham after that. And I became secretary of the Sandringham Footy Club, which is a position I still hold. So there's clashes in timetables and fixturing.
It's hard to fit everything.
Yeah, it's very hard to fit everything in, but I get back here as often as I can.
I'm intrigued about language in football, and I, like you, would describe myself as a mad Bulldogs supporter. And I think a lot of Bulldogs people, we reach for the word mad. Do you think that captures it?
That encapsulates it pretty well. There's people who have bled and almost died for this club, and there was many examples of that during the fight back, when people who could ill afford to give money came forward when they heard that the club was going to be taken over by Fitzroy. They came forward, and some people gave their pension cheques, even though they weren't assignable, gave their pension cheques across the table. And there were other people who stood on intersection corners who were on crutches and who stood for hours collecting money in tins. And there's a lot of people who have done the hard yards for this club, and I think that's a good way to encapsulate it, because they'll do things for this club that they wouldn't otherwise do.
It's a logical kind of dedication.
It's an illogical sort of faith in that, they treat the club, they do something for the club as if it was their own family member.
Yeah. We're in a reflective mood, 30 years since the 89 fight back, but what do you feel as you walk into the club this morning on a beautiful winter's morning, and you see the brand new facility, or close to, and club in a strong position? How does that make you feel?
Just a great sense of pride, like back in the 80s. This place here doesn't show any resemblance to what it was like back in the 80s, where this stand here was an old wooden stand, and it only sat something like 600 people.
Yeah.
And this was sort of the hub, the cornerstone of the home of the Bulldogs, was a grandstand that was made out of wood that had seating for 600 people. And we still had the E.J. Whitten stand, of course. But back in the late 80s, when the AFL were trying to push us away from the Western Oval, as part of a campaign to try and get the club to move, there was a fire order placed on the John Gent stand.
That it was a fire hazard.
That it was a fire hazard because it was built out of wood.
Yep.
And it was used as a lever to try and force the club to move, because the authorities were saying, at the instigation of the AFL, that the ground wasn't safe, wasn't fit to house home games and crowds. And so we faced this situation where the ground was basically condemned, and it was underdeveloped, so it was very difficult to attract corporate sponsors and substantial donors. So when you look at the home that the Bulldogs had then and compare it to what we've got now, it's worlds apart.
Yeah. Can I take me back? So we're going to cover a lot of ground, and hopefully you can fill in some of the details for me. So I'm someone who knows. I know the broad themes of the story and some of the big moments, but I'm really interested in your place in it. So you were working at the club at the time, and the role was...
I was a CEO.
CEO.
Yeah.
So that's right at the centre of it. And the club is essentially, who was in power at the time, had essentially decided that the merger would go ahead, and that you must have had a moment where you spoke to Peter Gordon or started this other movement of Save the Dogs. But that strikes me as quite a lonely moment that you were sort of won out. Does that
it was very lonely.
Describe it?
It was very lonely. We had a club best and fairest night, an infamous night at the Cadillac Bar, which was a nightclub in Carlton, and it was like a cocktail party. It wasn't like a sit-down formal dinner. It was like a cocktail party between 5:30 and 8:30.
Yep.
And there were speeches by the president and by Charlie Sutton, and the awards were conferred, and Terry Wallace won the best and fairest that year. And as the night was winding down, there was a number of us that converged around the bar, and I was the CEO, and Mick Malthouse had been tipped off about the merger. He was the coach in '89, and he'd been tipped off, and he'd abandoned the club and wasn't at the night. And, and he was appointed as coach of the West Coast Eagles. And so we were looking at appointing a new coach, and I was on the subcommittee to select this new coach, and I went to the best and fairest night because all the board members were going to be there, and the members were on this subcommittee to select the new coach.
Yep.
And at the end of the night, I was handing out these dossiers that I'd prepared on all the leading applicants, a shortlist if you like.
Yep.
And I was handing those out to the members of the subcommittee. And on doing that, one of the directors said, "Look, Dennis," because we had a meeting planned for the VFL the next day, which I believe that we were going in to discuss a rescue package that Peter and I were negotiating with the Footscray Council, and which we'll go into later if you want. But this director said, "Look, Dennis, tomorrow it's going to be announced that the club's going to merge with Fitzroy, and it's going to be called the Fitzroy Bulldogs, playing out at Princes Park in a Fitzroy Guernsey with a Fitzroy board and a Fitzroy president. And, you can have this back. I don't need that because this merger, it's 2 weeks old. It's going to be ratified tomorrow by the board at the AFL, and so we won't be needing this." And he thrust it back into my hand. And I said, "Look, this isn't happening, I don't know what you're talking about, but this isn't going to happen." And then he started pleading with me. He said, "You're not to mention this, you've just got to wait, you can't do anything, leave it till the morning and we'll go into the AFL and we'll sort this out." And I said, "Listen, this isn't going to happen this way." Anyway, he tried to stop me from leaving and I left.
Do you think, had you been sort of kept in the dark a little bit because they would have had you pegged as someone who would push back on it? Yeah.
There was 9 board members, and 3 of them were Save the Dogs candidates,
right?
Basically, and 1 board member was away overseas, and Nick Collum was the president then, and he had 5 votes. He had the other 5. I didn't know this at the time, but he had 5 other board members signed up to support the merger. And apparently this had been negotiated and documented 2 weeks earlier and was to be ratified at this meeting at the AFL the next day.
Yep.
And anyway, I left the best and fairest night and I went straight back to the club, with the marketing manager, who was a fellow called Brooke Anderson, and he subsequently passed away. But so I went back to the office, and I thought, I've got to get this out because we've got to put a stop to this. So I rang 3AW, and but by this stage it was about 5 to 9.
Right.
And I said, are any of the footy boys there? Because there was a show on at night.
Yeah.
And the receptionist said, look, all the footy boys are long gone. And I said, well, look, it's Dennis Galimberti. I'm the CEO of the Bulldogs. I need to speak to someone. And she said, well, there's a producer here. So I get onto this producer and I tell him the story that, I'd just been told the club had merged 2 weeks previously and it was going to be announced tomorrow officially, and that, it was going to be the Fitzroy Bulldogs playing out of a Fitzroy jumper at Princes Park under a Fitzroy coach and president. And this producer said, look, this is a big story, but he said that the news has been written. It's already been put to bed and it's going to be read out in 2 minutes' time. And he said, but look, the last segment that I've written in the news bulletin is about whatever it was. Yep. He said, when I get to that, I'll flick it back to you and you come on air and say, Dennis Galimberti, CEO of the Footscray Football Club, announced tonight. And then you just tell me what you just said.
Yep.
Right? But he said, you've only got 15 seconds, so you just be concise. So I read the news on 3AW that night. And so it sort of got out from there.
Wow.
And my next call was to Mick Stevens, who was a journalist at the Herald Sun.
How were you? What was your kind of emotion at this time? Were you just in a manic, just need action, or was there a...
It was pretty manic.
Fight or flight.
I was very distressed. See, I didn't know whether people were going to come back to the club.
Yep.
I didn't know whether the board was going to come back. I didn't know whether I was going to be escorted off the premises. Not that there was anyone there.
Yep.
So I didn't know how long I had.
Were you acting more on instinct than...
It was all instinct.
Yeah.
I was saying to Adrian before that at that moment, there wasn't much to indicate that the club could continue in any meaningful sort of a way.
Yep.
Because I think the last home game was against Richmond, and we only had 8,000 people there.
Yep.
And we were going to lose about $750,000 that year as a trading loss.
And that was a huge amount.
That was a huge amount back then, and that was going to take our total losses. The AFL tried to inflate the losses later to make it look worse for us.
Yep.
But it was going to take the losses to about 1.5, and we'd finished second last. I think Richmond finished last. I think we only won 5 games. We only had about 6,000 adult members.
Yeah.
So if you looked at all the indicators, there wasn't a lot of evidence, sort of hard forensic evidence, that would say that the club could continue in any sort of a meaningful way.
Except that the supporter base didn't know that it was under threat of
I
survival.
knew the only 2 things that I knew was that there was going to be a heavy backlash, like that the supporters would rile up, and I knew that Peter was there with a reform group that was a competent would-be board who would be ready to take over.
So you read the news on AW.
Well, the back end of it.
Does it get picked up by the papers for the following morning?
Yeah, it gets picked up by the papers the following morning. But
and is it a big story? Is it a
front page story?
Front page story.
Yeah.
Splashed across. So essentially, that's just you at that point. That's you're part of this resistance. When do you call Peter Gordon, and when does this sort of Save the Dogs team sort of take its?
Well, I next rang Michael Stevens at the Herald Sun, who was a mad Footscray supporter as well, and I rang him and I told him, and he was just gobsmacked, and he got sort of emotional. I said, look, I don't know how long I've got here in terms of how much time we've got. You've got to get the key elements down. And he said, look, this is he'd been a journalist for 20 years. He said, listen, I've never had a front page story. And I said, mate, get onto this. This is a front page story. And he said, yeah, it is. He said, I've got to go and see the editor because the front page has probably already been laid. He'd never been near a front page.
Yep.
And he said, well, get off the phone and get it written, because by this stage it was 9:30, you know.
Run out of time.
Yeah, running out of time. And so he spoke to the editor, and the editor said, yeah, whatever was on the front page, I don't know what it was, but it got thrown off, and this became the front page story. So the next morning when people woke up, it was all over the news, but it was also on the front page of the Herald Sun.
Wow.
So that sort of got us going.
Yep.
But
it would have annoyed the head office.
Oh, it annoyed them because they had the Footscray board filing in at something like 9 o'clock.
Yep.
Which they turned into a Footscray board meeting. It was never meant to be a Footscray board meeting, but they turned that meeting into a Footscray board meeting. But going back to Peter, so after I'd spoken to Michael Stevens, Peter had my direct line. He was up in Sydney fighting a case. I forget what case it was. And he rang me on my private line and said, someone's rung me and said this. And I said, yeah, well, why didn't you do something about it? I've told you that something like this could have been on the cards, because there was rumours and there was innuendo.
And they've been trying to shift it to Princess Park.
They've been trying to shift us to Princess Park. And
was this the mood of the times, that the VFL turning into the AFL and we're going to need to get rid of some of this?
Well, Ross Oakley had this vision, this master plan to contract the number of Melbourne clubs, because him and the AFL Commission believed that Melbourne couldn't support 11 clubs. Yep. So he had this agenda by stealth to reduce the number of Melbourne-based clubs. And I said to Peter, you know, what have you done? I've told you something like this was going to happen. You've done nothing about it. Anyway, I really ripped into him. But in fairness to him and I had been negotiating this rescue package with the Footscray Council, and he didn't want to do it. He had a number of people on a board that were ready to take over, and I was urging him to call an extraordinary meeting to take over the running of the club. But he didn't want to do it at that time because he said it might put the fears into the Footscray Council, who might become scared and withdraw or modify the rescue package. Right. So he had good reason for that, and I don't criticise him for that. Yeah. So he said, look, I'll get back as soon as I can. And he came back, I think, 2 or 3 days later. And we had another infamous meeting in the Footscray Social Club where we put together a thread of a plan to upset the AFL's plan.
It's extraordinary. So what was the next big moment after that?
Well, people started converging on the ground the next day. The offices were all closed, and
so you're talking about supporters and
people started converging on the ground,
and that
walking on the ground. They were walking into the social club.
So
people started taking memorabilia off the walls, because they thought the club's gone.
Yep.
The club's gone, and they were trying to gather any sort of piece of history or memorabilia or something to satisfy their sense of memory for the club. So there were people sort of descending on the club, taking things off the wall. It was chaotic. But people also walking around the ground.
Was it also the instinctive thing of the families in trauma, so you go back to the family home?
I think so. I think there was part of that in it. And people started to converge. We used to have a big plaster bulldog. I don't know whether you remember it, but there was a big plaster bulldog over the Whitten stand entrance. And people were converging around that. It should come back.
I think it's being cared for somewhere. We should unleash it again.
Yeah, I think we should.
Give it a fresh pump.
So people started. Someone got a megaphone, and people just started addressing the crowd informally with a megaphone.
Wow.
And it was chaotic. Some people started marching on AFL House. Other people stayed here.
So it was a bit rudderless at that point.
It was totally rudderless.
This energy and uprising, but
there was a lot of anger
and disbelief.
A lot of turmoil. Yeah, a lot of disbelief, a lot of emotion. people crying.
Mm.
But probably the next moment was, I announced it on the Monday night, which was the 2nd of October. Peter came back on the Wednesday, and there was probably 20-odd people in the social club. It was about 9:30 at night. Peter was angry because he got a speeding ticket back from the airport. And there was just a few of us, Les Twentyman, Steve Palmer. There was a few of us talking about what the next step was and what we could do. And we worked out that what we needed to do was to get a plaintiff, an aggrieved member, to take an action in the Supreme Court to seek an injunction to stop the merger being implemented.
Is this just to buy time, just to get something in to stop it being...
Yeah, to put a stake in the ground to stop it from going any further than it had.
Bulldozed, yep.
And we asked a couple of people whether they would be the plaintiff in this Supreme Court action. And
so you could any of you have been that, or you?
I could have, but because I was the CEO, there was a big media campaign launched against me and Peter.
Yep.
And the AFL was saying that I was responsible for the position the club was in because I'd been the CEO for the last 3.5 years.
Yep.
So they were saying that, listen, Galimberti, he's responsible for this. He's led the club into the demise.
Yeah, okay.
So there was this huge media campaign personally addressed to me.
Yep.
And so I couldn't really do it, even though I would have done it if I could have. I couldn't really be the face of it.
There's a nice symbolism to having a member that's not known. I mean,
absolutely.
And if this was a movie, and you know what, it probably could be a movie.
Yeah.
Irene Chatfield is kind of
she's the hero.
Exquisitely cast.
She is, and she's the hero or the heroine, because we asked a couple of people and they said, "Oh, look, I own a home and I've got a super fund or whatever," and they said, "We can't really do it." And we were thinking, well, who are we going to get to do this? Because we needed to move quickly, because this is now day 3. This is the end of day 3 into this merger.
There's a desperation.
There's a sense of desperation, and it becomes validated later, which I'll tell you about. And Irene burst into this huddle of about 6 blokes talking about what we're going to do next. And she said, "Do you need someone to go to court?" And we said, "Yeah, we do." She said, "Well, I'll go." And she sticks her hand up. And we said to her, "Look, do you realise that if we go to court and we lose, the AFL might bankrupt you or take your assets?" And she said, "I don't give a stuff. I'll go for the club."
Wow.
So that was very, and that was a very important step in the whole thing. So we went and saw the barristers the next day, who did the work pro bono, and they said, look, as we were preparing for this case, they said, look, just as well you got here when you did, because this is a long way down the track. Like, it was a lot further down the track than I thought.
Yeah, and you knew more than most.
I knew more than most, but it was a long way down the track. The Melways that came out in late October had us playing at a Princes Park as the Fitzroy Bulldogs.
It was in the Melways.
On the map.
Oh,
and in the index.
Oh, God.
But it was worse than that, because at this meeting, the AFL meeting next day of the Footscray board, the AFL convened a Footscray board meeting, and basically Ross Oakley said to them, "Look, this is what's been negotiated to merge with Fitzroy. This is how it's going to look. But if you think you're not going to agree, you've got to understand that this club's insolvent and you've been trading insolvent, and if you don't agree to sign up to this, you're going to be responsible for the club's debt, and there's also criminal sanctions." So he basically held a gun at their head. So even the 3 Save the Dogs board members, they ended up voting in favour because of the pressure that had been applied to them. But one of them, a fellow called Bob Moody, who was elderly, it made him feel so ill that he thought he'd had a heart attack.
Oh, God. Does that stand up legally now, that tactic by the AFL? Would that have...
no, it'll be duress and oppression, and there'd be a lot of things going against it now. But so they were basically forced, and Nick Collins said to them, look, if any of you think you're going to be heroes and vote against this for the record, you better think again, because if it's not unanimous, we're not going to go ahead with this merger, and you're all going to be responsible for the demise of this club. So he forced them into a position where they had to vote unanimously in favour of it. But there was one failing in the whole exercise and in the AFL plan, in that what they forgot to do in this bogus Footscray board meeting was they should have passed a resolution that the board had agreed to surrender its licence to play in the competition, because if they had minuted that resolution, there wouldn't have been anything to fight for. There wouldn't have been a court case, because if you surrender your licence, you're not in the competition and you don't have any rights. So the only resolutions that were passed, other than the Footscray board agreeing unanimously to this merger and then resigning and substituting AFL directors as Footscray directors, they forgot to do the most important thing, and that was to minute that the Footscray board agreed to surrender the licence to play in the competition. So it was mainly through their error that we were able to...
The door was ajar.
The door was ajar.
So from there, is it, okay, it just becomes a dollars and cents thing in the short term of how do we raise this money, and is that...
We had to get the injunction first. We've had the injunction, and as I said, the barrister says, luckily you got here, because the players were being assigned under the standard AFL player contract back then. The players for mobility and flexibility in the competition, there was a clause in the standard player contract where the players could be assigned from one club to another.
Right.
So the players' contracts had been assigned to Fitzroy, and the Footscray board had resigned, and AFL directors had been installed as Footscray directors. So the merger was a long way down the track. The club was closed. There was no administration. So it was a long way down the track. Now I've forgotten your question.
The
injunction was a critical thing, because if we hadn't have got that, we were nowhere. And a funny thing happened when Irene and I went to court. I had to swear an affidavit to get before the judge, and so did Irene. And one of the things that I had to swear in the affidavit was that the club was solvent, because you don't get the first base before the court. If you're insolvent, your application doesn't have any legs. And so I had to swear this affidavit to say that the club was solvent. And thank God that I didn't have to get in the witness box, because it would have been a hard case to prove in terms of the solvency. Anyway, it never got to that, luckily. But when we went before the judge, luckily the judge, we drew well. The judge was the brother of a fellow called Marks, who'd been the president of South Melbourne at the time of the Keep South at South group was established back in 1980. And so I think we drew well, because he had some sympathy for us.
Divine intervention.
Yeah, but he kept putting us to the test, and he kept saying to our barrister, look, because we went what's called ex parte. Ex parte means that you go to court without serving the other side with the documents. The application's so urgent and so critical that you go to court and you haven't served the other side of the summons or the supplementary material. So we went ex parte, and the judge is saying, well, Irene Chatfield, the plaintiff, is saying that the club's merged and it's going to be the Fitzroy Bulldogs, and she hasn't been consulted, and she's saying all these things. What does the AFL say about all this? Why aren't they here? And Tim Ganane's sort of stammering, and luckily another member of the legal team saw and the court's full of supporters, like the court, the balcony, it's just full of Bulldog supporters and red, white and blue. And a member of our legal team pulled on Tim Ganane's gown and said, Tony Nolan's at the back of the court. And Tony Nolan was a barrister who was on a permanent retainer from the AFL. Like he was paid just to sit there in case they needed him. And he wasn't retained to appear. He only had a watching brief to come and see what we were doing.
Yep.
So he's sitting at the back of the court. And one of our members of our legal team pulled on Tim Ganane's gowns and said, Tony Nolan's at the back of the court. And on this, Tim says to the judge, well, Mr. Nolan's in court, Your Honour. And the judge looks down the back of the court and says, Mr. Nolan, do you appear for the AFL? And this Nolan should have said, no, I don't. But what he did was he puffed his chest out like this and said, yes, Your Honour, as it turns out, I do. And he approaches the bar table and the judge says to him, well, what's going on, Mr. Nolan? Mrs. Chatfield's saying that your clients merged the club with Fitzroy without consulting the membership. And this Nolan says, well, I don't know, Your Honour. And the judge says, well, if you don't know, you better find out. I'm going to grant this injunction for 21 days. You better be back in this court in 21 days to tell me what's going on. So we got the 21-day reprieve without Irene or I having to get in the box, which was probably a good thing and for the case. And Tony Nolan then he sort of whispers across the across the bar table to our barrister, I've just given yourself enough rope for you to hang yourself.
Oh.
So it was still on.
Yeah.
It was still on.
It's cold.
Yeah, but luckily we got that reprieve. And as it turned out, the 21-day injunction, the way the calendar fell, it was only about 19 days.
Yep.
So we were cheated of 2 days, which sounds silly, but we thought that was crucial at that time. And then we met. Peter had we called it the Board in Exile. It was a Footscray board of Footscray fanatics who were never properly elected, who came together to steer the club out of this merger. And then we met and we formulated this fundraising strategy.
And that was when the plan of the rally.
Yeah, the rally was born out of that. But by this stage, it was the Thursday, or it might have even been the Friday of that same week, and we had to get going. So we called the rally for the Sunday morning.
Wow.
So we only had 2 or 3 days to organise this rally. Anyway, excuse me, I was going to Slater and Gordon each day because the club was closed. There was no Footscray officials, there was no Footscray board. There was 3 appointed AFL board members onto the Footscray board, but they weren't doing anything to help us. They were still trying to arrange for this merger to happen in the background.
Is it about as close as you can get to not having a club?
Yeah, I think the club had folded. I think at that point there wasn't a club.
There wasn't a club.
There wasn't a club. And just as a funny aside,
just a pulse.
Yeah, I was going to Slater and Gordon because we didn't have any offices, and if there was any solicitors away that day or in court, I used to sit at their desk, which Peter said I could, obviously.
Hot desking before it was fashionable.
Yeah, and there'd be solicitors complaining to the office manager, there's this funny bloke with a beard who's got this strange voice who keeps talking down the phone. And so I had to keep moving and moving. So I used to get in there about 6 a.m, and because we only had 19 days, and I'd go home at about 10 o'clock at night.
So you just everyone's put life on hold. So
life was on hold.
The inner sanctum of this movement was put life on hold. We've got 19 days.
I'd resigned.
Yep.
I resigned on air that night on 3AW.
Yep.
And so we didn't have jobs, we didn't have income. And I'd go into Slater and Gordon about 6 a.m, to start. My job was to try and organise this fundraising and organise corporate sponsors on the basis that if we can get readmitted, will you sponsor us?
Yep.
Which was it was a hard road to hoe.
Trying to get ahead of it.
Because a lot of the corporate sponsors were saying, hang on a minute, you're not there. There's all this media about how bad the position was. The AFL was saying we were over $2 million in debt. The ground had been condemned. The club hadn't been managed responsibly, they were saying. Galimberti's a jerk. All this sort of stuff. And I get home at 10 o'clock at night, and my wife said, there's a bloke and he keeps coming to the door. And one morning he came at 9, and one morning he came at 8, and one morning he came at 7. He's looking for you. And I said, well, who is he? And he said, he won't say. Anyway, so the next morning I got up to go into Slater and Gordon at 6 o'clock, and there's this bloke waiting for me in a car. And he says, are you Dennis Galimberti? And I said, yeah. And he said, I've got this Supreme Court writ to serve on you. And I said, oh yeah, give us a look at it. Anyway, I was the defendant, together with a bloke called Paul Barber, who you might know, who was a radio broadcaster on 3LO. And I was named as a defendant. And he said, you Dennis Galimberti? And I said, yeah. And he said, will you accept service of this summons? I said, yeah. And I said, what's it about? And he said, I don't know. He said, but I'm going to your rally on Sunday, and the fee I'm getting for serving this summons on you, the $15 fee I'm getting for serving this summons on you, I'm going to donate it to the rally. And I said, that's fantastic. So anyway, Nick Holland had served a writ on me, claiming that I defamed him in a radio interview. But what it was really about was that he didn't want me to speak at this public rally. And the way defamation works, if you get served with a defamation writ and you continue to speak in the face of the writ about the substance of what's complained of in the writ, you aggravate the damages. So it's very effective in stopping people from what's called compounding the defamation.
Right.
Anyway, so I've got this writ in the Supreme Court that's asking for unspecified damages, and I'm living in this little house in Kensington, wooden house in Kensington with no job and a $35,000 mortgage on a house that was worth $40,000. And I thought, this is getting serious. Anyway, I get to the rally. I spoke to Peter about it, and I said, so I'm not going to be able to speak at the rally. And he said, yes, you are. And I said, no, I'm not. And he said, look, if you don't speak at this rally, I don't think the rally's going to fly. He said, there's 3 crucial things. We've got to have a board to take over. He says, I've got that. I've got to have a playing list. And he said, I'm working on that, and I need your help on that, because if we didn't have any players, I don't think it would have flown.
There needs to be something to
There needs to be something there.
Tangible.
Yeah. And he said, you've got to speak to explain what's happened. And I said, all right, I'll do it then. Anyway.
He can be very persuasive, Peter.
Yeah, well, I didn't have a choice, let's be honest. I didn't have a choice, right? And I get down to the ground. Anyway, the rally's meant to start at 10 o'clock. And I get down to the ground at 9:30, and it's raining. It's raining, and all the radio news spots are saying this rally to save the Bulldogs. There's nobody at the ground. There's no point turning up. There's nobody at the ground. The club's merged, and this was all fed by the AFL.
Yep.
And other than the Herald Sun were good to us, but other than the Herald Sun and Mick Stevens and a couple of others. All the press early days were all on the side of the AFL that this merger of Fitzroy was going to be a good thing. So things were looking grim, because if nobody had have turned up, and at 9:30 there was hardly anyone here. Anyway, I had to talk to some people, the Westerners and a few other groups, about putting some money in. Anyway, I go out on the ground at 10 o'clock, and there's over 10,000 people here. There's more people here than were at the last home game. Anyway, of course, Peter puts me on first. And I thought, shit, what am I going to say? And I said, I remember my opening words were, I've been served with a Supreme Court writ by Nick Holland to stop me from speaking, but that's not going to stop me from speaking, and I'm here today to tell you that I never sold out on you. Anyway, on saying that, 10,000 people stand up at the one time and give me a standing ovation. And I thought, well, that's never happened before. And anyway, from there, we raised $450,000 in one day, in one morning, basically. Yep. And we knew from that point onwards, we could smell that we're a chance here.
Was it until that moment? So the drive out to the rally, was it excitement, fear? Was there a fear of what if we don't show up, or was it just adrenaline?
Fear, adrenaline, emotion, a lot of things. But that morning, the AFL served a letter on me, and it was addressed to Peter Gordon, and Peter's probably got it. I don't have it any longer, but the letter was addressed to Peter Gordon, and it was from Ross Oakley, and it was about a 3-page letter, and it basically said, listen, if you think this club's going to continue in the competition, you're wrong. These are my words. Yeah. And that if you think that paying out the club's debt is going to solve your problems, you've got another thing coming, because to be a member of this competition, you've got to do several things. And he laid out several things. Back in those days, it probably cost $3 million to run a club.
Yep.
And he's put out all these projections in these tables that in 1990 you need $5 million, in 91 you need $7 million.
Shifted the goalposts.
Yeah, shifted the goalposts and said, look, this is all futile because this is all the things that you need to do and you can't do any of them. But like the letter was addressed to Peter, but it was served on me at my house, like as if they don't know where Peter lives, or like Peter was a partner at Slater and Gordon, as if they don't know where he is. So there was this campaign that was directed partially against Peter, but also against me, to try and intimidate us. It was really basically it was war. Yeah. And it was going to be a fight. It was going to be a fight to the death.
What was the moment of maybe not victory, but that the club would remain? Was there a moment for you, or did it happen over? Was it just sort of a gradual?
It was a gradual thing, but I think on the day of the rally, when we had $450,000 in cash, there was no corporate support in that. There wasn't a dollar from the corporates in that. It was all cash. And
so essentially, those dollars are even worth more than.
They were worth more than corporate dollars, because the corporates were saying we may support the club if you get back in, if you can prove you're solvent, if you do this, if you do that. And the corporate support flowed later, but it was only after the VFL or the AFL announced that we were back in the competition that the corporate support flowed. So the money just came from the people. It came from all over Melbourne, but it mainly came from the people out west.
Incredible. The tin rattling. I was only a little kid at the time, but I do have a memory of the rattling of the tins on the news. I was only a little kid. And you had a coach, and you had a team.
Yeah, well, Peter rang Terry Wheeler. Peter was fishing on a fishing trip somewhere in northern New South Wales, and Peter said to him, we've got this rally tomorrow. I've got a board. We had 25 players agreed to come to the rally, because a lot of them were scared. A lot of them had been warned off. Doug Hawkins, for example, who was sympathetic to us, he wanted to play for Footscray, he didn't want to play for anyone else. He'd been warned off. The AFL had told him that if he spoke against the merger, he wouldn't get a contract with Fitzroy. So there were people who had been warned off. But we got 25 players who agreed to come to the rally. Libba was one. Steve McPherson.
Was Doug there? Was he at the rally?
Look, I think he was. He was at the rally, but he didn't speak. Yeah, he didn't speak.
What was it like to stand up on the stage and in front of those people? What was the overriding emotion in that crowd?
I think they were ready for a fight.
Yeah.
They'd come to fight, and they were prepared to give everything they had to make sure that the club would continue. They were up for it. There was no doubt about that.
It's an incredible story. It's an amazing story.
It is a big story.
It's such an important story for... And we're in the phase at the moment of retelling it to the rest of the world, but I think it's been important for us to hear it as Bulldogs people. I'd love to think that the current players would hear this story and they'd hear your version of it in your
I think the big thing for the players is that if you can translate it to the position they're in, is that sometimes there may not be a lot of evidence or proof for the fact that we're going to succeed, but you don't necessarily need to point to things that are on your side for you to win. On that night, when I pre-announced this merger, there wasn't a lot of evidence for the fact that the club could continue or succeed in its own right. But sometimes if you've got the commitment and the resolve and the belief in people and in your own ability, sometimes you can carry the day without there being a lot of intrinsic evidence for the fact that you can win.
Yeah, I just think I think the word culture in modern times, and especially in modern footy, is probably thrown around a little bit loosely. But when I hear this story, I get an enormous sense of pride of this is our culture, of the loneliness of that you endured, but then that instinctive something's got to be done, got to act. Irene Chatfield to walk into that group of men and say, I'll be the one to go to court. Peter Gordon to lead it, that moment. There's that little bit of loneliness before the action, and I think that's real leadership and real culture.
There was a lot of loneliness.
And Terry Wheeler driving through the night to...
He drove all night to get to that rally.
And the players being fearful of but I'll go.
Yeah, they went and they were photographed as being there.
And of course our supporters of giving money they maybe didn't have, and that moment of, what should we do? Well, we should go to the ground. We should support. We should fight. The instinct to fight, I think.
Well, it was tribal.
Yeah, I think
it was a tribal instinct that they knew they had to be here to fight for what they believed in. They had their own set of values, and part of their values was not only the history of this club, but their involvement in it and its future, and they weren't prepared to let that go for anyone.
Dennis, thank you so much for sitting down to chat with me. On behalf of the club in its current state and the players and anyone who's attached to it, as someone who came after that time, I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for having that instinct to fight, and for allowing us to have the club we have today that's not just surviving but thriving.
Thanks, Bob. It's been a pleasure to be on.